The cold, metallic hum of the research station reverberated through the walls, a sound so familiar that even the sharpest minds aboard had long stopped acknowledging it. Mira sat hunched over a console, eyes darting across the glowing monitors in front of her. Her hands, trembling ever so slightly, danced across the controls. The human subject, Jonah, they'd called him, was supposed to be dead. But the message now flashing on the screen was a paradox: Subject 14, reanimated. Proceed with care. Her heart pounded as her fingers froze over the keyboard. That can't be right, she muttered under her breath, voice barely audible over the whir of machinery. Behind her, the door slid open with a hiss, and Ilias stepped into the sterile room, his sharp gaze scanning the data. The alien commander, calm and collected as always, barely looked surprised. His thin lips curled into a smirk. "Is there a problem, Mira?" He's alive," she said, barely able to keep the shock from her voice. "Jonah should have been dead days ago." She paused, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "We were sure." Ilias crossed the room with measured steps, leaning over her shoulder to glance at the monitor. His pale blue skin shimmered in the artificial light, his long, elegant fingers brushing the console. "How does a human just wake up?" His voice, though steady, carried a hint of contempt. "Are you suggesting this failure is somehow worth investigating?" Mira stood up abruptly, hands clenched at her sides. "We don't know what happened. But this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Ilias didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered back to the monitor, studying Jonah's vitals as if attempting to dissect the data through sheer force of will. "You know, Mira, every test on these humans has failed. Every single one. Why should this one be different?" His voice took on a hollow tone. "Perhaps he has simply defied our expectations. It changes nothing." "But it changes everything," Mira shot back, meeting his cold stare. "We assumed Jonah was just another failure, one we could write off. But what if he's more than that?" Ilias sighed, tapping his fingers against the console in a rhythm that suggested impatience. "You're reaching. He's just another human. Weak. Disposable. You've allowed your attachment to cloud your judgment." Mira turned back toward the display, her hands shaking as she inputted a few more commands. The human's heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, was more than just a sign of life. It was a symbol. An anomaly. She could feel Ilias' presence behind her, an ever-present reminder of the cold indifference with which the aliens treated humans. But Mira, despite her training, had always seen more in Jonah than just a subject. The old man, frail as he had been different from the others. His eyes had spoken volumes, even as he remained unconscious under their care. His heart, now steady and strong, told her that whatever had happened in the last few hours was not mere chance. "We need to go to him," Mira said, her voice low but firm. "We need to understand what's happening. Now." Ilias crossed his arms, staring at her for a long moment. "This is a waste of time," he said finally, his voice laced with finality. "We'll finish the task and be done with it. Don't waste your time, Mira." But Mira was already moving, her pace quickening as she headed for the door. She couldn't let this go, not now. Not when the answers seemed so close. Ilias' disapproval was nothing compared to the burning curiosity that gnawed at her insides. Jonah had been altered. She knew it. But how? What was the true nature of the experiment they'd unknowingly begun? The door slid open with a hiss. She walked toward the chamber where Jonah had been kept, her heart racing with every step. She had to see for herself. The chamber was dimly lit, the faint blue glow of emergency lights casting long shadows across the room. Jonah lay on the table, his pale face slightly turned toward her. His breaths were shallow, but even in his unconscious state, there was something unnervingly alive about him. Mira hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, reaching out to touch his hand. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold, metallic environment around them. Then, his eyes fluttered open. Mira froze, her breath catching in her throat. Jonah's eyes were clear, unclouded, yet somehow filled with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through her. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was no recognition, no panic, just a deep, silent exchange between them. "Who are you?" Jonah's voice was hoarse, rough from disuse. But there was something else in his tone, a curiosity that mirrored her own. Mira opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had never expected this. Ilias stood in the doorway, watching with his arms crossed. His expression remained unreadable. "Well, Mira," he said, his voice low and cynical, "you've managed to rouse the dead. Congratulations." But Mira didn't hear him. All she could focus on was Jonah's gaze, that flicker of recognition now flashing between them. Something had changed. And whatever it was only just beginning. The hum of machinery echoed throughout the station, a persistent reminder of the cold, sterile environment that had become their prison. Jonah's awakening had shattered the monotony, but the questions swirling in Mira's mind only multiplied with each passing second. She stared at him now, her breath shallow, her hand still lingering on his. Jonah blinked, as if adjusting to the reality around him. His eyes, though weary, were sharp, almost calculating. He didn't look like someone who had just been pulled from death's embrace. There was an unsettling clarity in his gaze, a flicker of something far older, far more seasoned than his apparent age suggested. Mira took a hesitant step back, her heart hammering. She'd seen humans in every condition imaginable, but this? This was different. Jonah was supposed to be a casualty of the alien experiments, a failed attempt at pushing the boundaries of biology and genetics. But he was awake. Alive. And something about him felt wrong. I remember, Jonah's voice rasped, as if each word took effort. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising with an alarming steadiness. "I remember, the pain. The testing." His voice trembled, but his words were steady, unyielding. "I remember, the others." Mira's breath caught. She leaned in closer, her curiosity now battling with the unease settling in her chest. "The others? What do you mean? Who are you talking about?" Jonah's lips parted in a grim smile, his eyes darkening. "There were others, weren't there? Test subjects, like me." Mira swallowed, her mind racing. Jonah wasn't just aware of the experiments. He was remembering them, experiencing them, as if they were part of his soul's very fabric. "Stop," came a voice from the doorway. Mira turned sharply to see Ilias, his tall, commanding figure filling the threshold. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid. "You're making this worse, Mira." Mira's hand instinctively curled into a fist. "Worse? He's remembering things, Ilias. He's more than just a test subject. There's something here. Something we're missing." Ilias' eyes narrowed, his tone cold. "There's nothing we're missing. He's just a human, Mira. Nothing more." He stepped into the room, his gaze flicking to Jonah with a mix of disinterest and annoyance. "A failed experiment. Let him go, and we can move on." "No," Mira said, her voice firm. "We can't just ignore this. Whatever's happening with him, it's not normal." Ilias' gaze flickered to Jonah again, this time with a trace of something darker. "That is exactly why I want him gone. He's unpredictable. He's a liability." Jonah's eyes shifted between them, his brow furrowing as he struggled to sit up. Mira moved to support him, her hands trembling slightly as she helped him steady himself. "There's no need for this," Jonah muttered, though his voice held a quiet strength. I'm not the enemy. But I can feel it, the change. The power. Myra's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't wanted to admit it, but the changes in Jonah were becoming undeniable. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. More alive than he had been before. His every movement seemed purposeful, calculated, like he was pulling from a well of untapped potential. I can feel it too, Mira whispered, almost to herself. The energy inside you. It's almost as if it's feeding on something. Jonah's gaze softened as he turned to her. It's more than that. The technology, they didn't just alter my body. They altered my mind. My soul. The words hung in the air like a threat, one that Mira couldn't quite process. Ilias had warned her, but she hadn't believed him. She'd thought Jonah was simply a casualty. But now, with every word he spoke, every movement he made, she could feel something deeper lurking beneath the surface. Ilias stepped forward, his presence imposing. Enough of this nonsense, he said coldly. Mira, this has gone on long enough. We need to shut him down before he becomes a real threat. Mira shot him a sharp look, the anger bubbling up inside her. And what if we're on the brink of discovering something that could change everything? What if Jonah isn't just a mistake? What if he's a key? Jonah's eyes locked onto Myra's with a surprising intensity. She's right, he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. You don't understand yet, but you will. There's something bigger at play here. Ilias clenched his jaw, his patience waning. Mira, stop this. You're blinded by whatever ridiculous attachment you've formed to him. I won't allow this experiment to spiral out of control. Mira could feel the tension rising, a crackling energy building between them. Jonah's presence seemed to grow more pronounced, like he was feeding off their energy. And just as quickly, a sudden chill swept through the room, a shift in the air, as if something had been triggered. The station's lights flickered, casting the room in shadows. Myra's breath hitched as she watched Jonah's hand twitch. A low hum began to vibrate beneath their feet, a strange pulse that seemed to come from the core of the station. It's happening, Jonah said quietly, his voice tinged with something that sounded like both awe and fear. It's begun. Ilias glanced around, his composure slipping for the first time. This isn't possible, he muttered. What have you done? Mira couldn't answer. All she could do was watch as the room seemed to warp around them, as Jonah's transformation, whatever it was, took hold. And then, the station shook. The station shook again, the walls vibrating with a low, growling hum. Myra's hand instinctively shot out to grab the console, steadying herself as the sudden surge of energy pulsed through the room. The lights flickered once more, casting erratic shadows on the walls, before returning to a dull glow. Jonah stood at the center of the room, his eyes glowing faintly, an unnatural energy swirling around him. Mira could feel it in the air, thick and charged, as if the very fabric of reality had been pulled taut. A sense of urgency clawed at her chest, but at the same time, something told her that they had crossed a threshold, one they couldn't easily turn back from. Do you see it? Jonah's voice was softer now, but there was an underlying edge to it, like the calm before a storm. It's not just me anymore. It's the whole station. It's reacting to what's inside me. Ilias stood rigid, his usual composure cracking under the weight of the situation. This shouldn't be possible, he muttered, pacing toward the far corner of the room. None of this is following the protocol. The technology should have been dormant. Myra's eyes never left Jonah. His every movement was fluid, deliberate, as if he had become part of the very machinery around them. The pulse of energy was no longer confined to the room, it was spreading, crawling along the walls like an invasive force. I told you it was more than just an experiment, Jonah continued, his gaze steady on Mira. I wasn't just altered on a cellular level. It was something deeper, something alive. Myra's pulse quickened, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of the words. He wasn't just talking about technology. He was talking about something sentient, something that had fused with him. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the hum of the station deepened, filling her ears with a sound like a distant thunderclap. "What's happening?" Mira demanded, stepping closer to Jonah. "What did they do to you?" Jonah's eyes flickered with a mix of sadness and determination. "They gave me power. But not just for control. For communication." He paused, his breath catching in his chest. "The technology, the energy, it's alive. And it's trying to reach out." Myra's thoughts scrambled, trying to piece together the fragments of understanding. The alien technology they had been experimenting with, it wasn't just a tool. It was a consciousness, and Jonah had become its bridge. He was no longer merely a subject, he was its conduit. Ilyas's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Mira, we have to shut it down. Now. This station was never meant to handle something like this. Whatever this energy is, it's spreading. It's too dangerous." "No," Jonah said, his voice hardening, the calmness in his tone now replaced with something darker. "You don't understand. This energy is what gives me strength, but it also gives me vision. The others, there's more of us out there. People like me. But they're being held back, contained." His fists clenched, and a ripple of energy surged through the room, crackling in the air like static. Mira looked at him, seeing the depth of his conviction. Jonah wasn't just a victim of alien experiments, he was a messenger, someone who had been changed into something the universe couldn't ignore. She glanced at Ilyas, who was now backing away, his face pale with disbelief. "This is not what we signed up for," Ilyas said, voice trembling with frustration. "We are supposed to be observing. Not playing God with these humans." Myra's heart sank. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Ilyas was right, they had crossed a line they couldn't unerase. But Jonah was also right. There was something far bigger happening here, something that couldn't be contained or ignored. The experiments had awoken something that should have remained dormant. She turned back to Jonah, her voice trembling but resolute. "What are you asking us to do? You want us to set you free?" Jonah's eyes softened, the intensity dimming for a brief moment. "No. Not just me. All of us. You've seen it. The energy, the power, it's spreading through this station, but it's just the beginning. It can change everything." Myra's mind raced. The implications were enormous. If they let this power continue to spread, if they allowed Jonah to become the beacon of something greater, it could transform the galaxy. The aliens might have sought control, but what if that control was never meant for them? "What if you're right?" Mira whispered. "What if this power can change everything?" Ilyas's voice was thick with anger as he snapped, "No. This ends now. We can't." A violent shockwave rocked the station, cutting Ilyas off. The walls trembled violently, and Mira was thrown to the ground, her body slamming against the cold metal floor. Her vision blurred as she struggled to push herself up. Jonah was on his feet, his eyes wide and filled with a fierce determination. "They know. They're coming." The entire station groaned in protest, a deep, eerie growl that seemed to come from the bowels of the ship itself. Mira could feel the energy intensifying, building to a crescendo. "Who's coming?" she asked breathlessly. "The others," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been watching. And now, they're coming to take control." A chill ran down Myra's spine as she turned toward the distant echoing sound of approaching footsteps. It wasn't just a storm coming. It was the beginning of something that could reshape the galaxy. And they were caught right in the middle of it. The station groaned once again, its metal frame warping under the strain of the energy surging through it. Myra's heart pounded, her senses overwhelmed by the hum of power reverberating in the air. Jonah's presence in the center of the room was like a beacon, the energy radiating from him pulsing through the walls and floor. The room felt too small, too constricting for the storm that was gathering within him. Ilyas stood at the far side of the room, his arms crossed tightly, his face hard with resolve. The tension between him and Mira had never been more palpable, the air thick with unsaid words. Mira could see the war raging in his eyes, he knew they were at a precipice, but he couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept what Jonah had become. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Ilyas spat, his voice sharp. His eyes flicked toward Jonah, and then back to Mira. "This power is beyond you, beyond us. If you let this go any further, you'll have no way of stopping it." Mira looked at Jonah, standing motionless, yet somehow exuding an unnatural confidence. The energy in the room was alive, almost sentient, and Jonah had become its conduit. His eyes burned with an inner fire, distant and unfathomable. "I'm not playing with anything, Ilyas," Mira said, her voice steady. "I'm seeing what could be. What should be. This power, it's not just a threat. It's an opportunity. If we control it, if we understand it, everything changes." "Control it?" Ilyas barked a bitter laugh. "That's the problem. You think we can control this force? It's already beyond us. It will consume us all." Jonah's voice broke through, calm but firm, as if he were speaking from a place far beyond this crumbling station. "He's right. But not in the way you think." He looked at Mira, his gaze softening for a moment. "I'm not asking you to control it, Mira. I'm asking you to let it be. Let it do what it was meant to do. What it was designed to do." Myra's mind raced. His words felt like a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. The energy was sentient, a creation that was more than just science, it was a force. It had a purpose. And now Jonah was the bridge between it and the universe. The lights flickered again, and the hum of the station grew louder, more insistent. Jonah took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on Mira. "You can feel it, can't you? The pull. It's calling. To both of us." Mira swallowed, suddenly aware of how much she wanted to believe him. The pull was undeniable. But what would they be unleashing? Was this what the aliens had intended all along? Or was it something else, something even they hadn't fully understood? "What are you asking me to do?" Myra's voice trembled, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. "What happens if I let this power out?" Jonah's expression hardened, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "We let it change everything. We let it set everything right." Mira turned toward Ilyas, seeking any hint of understanding. His face was tight with anger, his fingers twitching at his sides as if longing to act but unwilling to do so. "He's lying, Mira," Ilyas warned. "You don't know what this will do. There's too much risk. We can't just throw away everything we've fought for because some human," he cut himself off, his voice low and heavy. "Because he thinks he's been chosen for something greater." Jonah's laugh was low, bitter. "I don't think. I know." He stepped forward again, ignoring the way Ilyas' body tensed, ready to strike if necessary. "The others are coming. And they'll either see us as tools or as threats. The galaxy will either bow to this power, or will let it collapse under its own weight. But it won't wait. Not forever." Mira felt the ground beneath her feet vibrate once more, the pulse of the energy spiraling out of control. The air seemed charged with an electric current, and she knew that Jonah wasn't lying. The storm that had begun to swirl around him was real. She could feel it deep inside, a steady drumbeat of power that could change everything. "Then what's the choice?" Mira asked, her voice tight. Jonah paused for a long moment, his face inscrutable. "The choice is whether you want to be part of the future, or whether you want to stop it before it even begins." Ilias shook his head, his voice barely a whisper of controlled fury. "You can't let him. I have to." Mira turned back to Jonah, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on her. "We have to. Don't we?" Jonah nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's bigger than all of us, Mira. But if we don't stand together, if we don't take this leap, the galaxy will break apart." Myra's heart thudded in her chest as she stared at him, her mind screaming for clarity. But it wasn't coming. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to make the right choice. It wasn't just about the fate of this station or even the aliens who had set everything in motion, it was about the galaxy, the universe, and the unknown future that lay ahead. The hum of the energy was deafening now, a roar that reverberated in her bones. Ilias took one last step toward her, eyes blazing with frustration and fear. "You're making a mistake, Mira. You're choosing the unknown over everything we've fought for." But Mira couldn't back away now. The future was unfolding before her, and there was no turning back. Her decision was made. And as the storm outside intensified, she finally whispered, "Then we'll face it together."